Vladimir Putin senses weakness in United States leadership and in global leadership, and he believes that now is the time for him to try to reclaim past glory in Russia. Okay, let's think about this from a psychological perspective. Vladimir Putin considers the collapse of the Soviet Union and Russia losing the Cold War in the late 80s, the Berlin Wall coming down, the collapse of all of Russia's land, and the collapse of the USSR to represent a fundamental failure of Russia's historical legitimacy. And so, as a former KGB member, Putin is all about reclaiming Russian homeland and Russia's sphere of influence. So we were talking about this earlier, and Buck and I had, I think, a pretty good discussion about this in the larger context here. A lot of what you have to deal with when you're dealing with a guy like Putin is this is not playing a traditional game. The motives and motivations of someone like Putin are different than what a rational actor might be motivated by. In other words, let me take a step back. In the United States, if there are financial constraints on a business, on a state, on a government, those are significant penalties because we're a capitalistic organization. And in general, the goal of capitalistic organizations and of a capitalistic government is to expand the overall pie of available assets for all of the people involved. And that's why capitalism is and remains, and I believe always will be, the foundation of all global success, right? Growing the pie constantly. If you study history, capitalism has lifted more humans out of bondage, more humans out of extreme poverty than anything ever in the history of the world, okay? And so we behave in a rational, Western-based focus with the idea being, hey, if we levy these significant sanctions on Russia, they're going to change their behavior. Well, you just saw that Vladimir Putin effectively thumbed his nose at the idea of sanctions. Why did he do that? Because he doesn't respect Western authority and he doesn't fear Joe Biden. Now, some people get mad at me. The reality, in my opinion, is Putin was afraid of Trump because he didn't exactly know what Trump was going to do from one moment to the next. Trump was the poker player who might be bluffing at any point in time. And Trump convinced Putin that if he invaded and tried to take Ukraine, and I think he did the same thing to Chairman Xi in China, that if they made an effort to go grab Ukraine or Taiwan, that there were going to be significant consequences. There was not the belief that Joe Biden was willing to take the same tack. There was no fear of Biden. And these autocratic leaders, these authoritarian dictators in many ways, in China and in Russia, ultimately fear consequences from other people that they believe might do them ill. And that is what Trump represented. And again, one of the big problems that the blue check marks have, and we had Trump on the show Tuesday. I'd encourage you to go listen to the full hour because it was an interesting conversation. But one of the real problems that the blue check marks have is explaining why Vladimir Putin didn't do anything to Ukraine for the 4 years when Donald Trump was in office, and why, relatively speaking, China was very muted as it became in relation to Taiwan while Trump was in office. But as soon as Trump is out of office, my concern, and if you listen to the Clay and Buck show, I started saying this months ago, is that my concern was China and Taiwan, and Russia and Ukraine, that Russia and China might enter into some sort of relationship whereby China nodded and didn't really go against Russia when they took Ukraine, and Russia did the same when China took Taiwan. That was going to be a dual-fronted war. And if you remember, Putin traveled to China, to Beijing, for the opening of the Winter Olympics, and he waited until the Olympics was over, and then he unleashed holy hell on Ukraine. And right now, there's so many questions surrounding Ukraine, but one of the most prominent ones is, how long will the Ukrainian people fight, and what sort of significant casualties and consequences can they bring to bear against Vladimir Putin? That's the question. But how did we get to this world where, after generations where effectively there was no major invasion of one country by another country, suddenly we see Russian tanks rolling across the borders into Ukraine? We've got Russian planes flying in, dropping bombs everywhere. What is taking place that we have created this recipe for this to occur? And I believe ultimately it is rooted in weakness from Joe Biden that was directly connected in many ways to what happened in Afghanistan. Whether or not you want to believe it, everybody can have different theories. When the United States pulled so disastrously out of Afghanistan, when we left everything behind, it made many people question the strength of the United States and our management acumen.